welcome to the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson, and this is episode 11. I'm going to be talking about patriarchy today. So, this is kind of a hot topic, I guess. It's one of those really controversial topics that I love talking about. Patriarchy is something that I think has been badly defined a lot. And I would just define it as the rule of fathers. And I am not a fan of patriarchy. I'll just get that out of the way. And the reason I'm not a fan of it is primarily for a really, really simple reason. I know a lot has been said about patriarchy, and there's been a lot of intellectual discussion about it. But the main reason why I'm against patriarchy is simply because we're mammals. It's because we're mammals. We are part of a group of animals who give birth to living. So, as opposed to eggs, we give birth to living babies. And we also nurse our offspring with memories, with breasts, and they call that mammals. So mammals is named after mothers. It's named after mammary glands. It's essentially all about moms. So it's very absurd that we now have this system of culture that puts the other parent first, the father. Now, many of us know also that paternity is often contentious. A lot of people are not sure who their father is. And so it really doesn't make sense to use the secondary person in the sexual reproduction and in the secondary role as the first one. It just is very backwards. So, a little bit about our ancient history. There is a lot of evidence to show that we were a matriarchal and matrilineal society. I mean, the evidence is really all mammals. It's not just human beings, it's not just history. It's really clear that the female of the species is the more important one when it comes to parenting, to the point where she gestates. We gestate our infant for 9 months, and then for often a year or even more after that, the infant is nursed by its mother through her own body. So it's just natural that we would have a cultural and intellectual system that would honor that basic part of our biology, but we don't. Now, just to be clear, there are other animals that do put the male first. In our great ape cousins, our closest relatives in the animal world, the chimpanzees, we have two examples of different kinds of chimpanzees with very different types of societies. One of them is more patriarchal in the sense that the offspring of a female in a group will often leave, and especially the females. So they don't stay with their mother in the long term. They do leave. But we also see in those chimpanzees that they are very violent. I heard Jane Goodall, who was famous for studying chimpanzees, recently said that chimpanzees are not her favorite animal for the reasons that they're so much like us. They are violent. They often kill each other. They're also known for killing people sometimes. And actually, the female of the species can be very violent too, and they're known to occasionally, when they go off the rails, will go and kill other females' children. So they will commit infanticide. So, not exactly a very peaceful species. On the other hand, we have the bonobo, which is another kind of chimpanzee, a subspecies, and they do follow the matrilineal or matriarchal type of society, and they are much more peaceful. They are very sexually open with each other. they tend to use that as a way to diffuse tension. And they are not known for killing each other or engaging in war or those types of behaviors. So that is pretty interesting, that we have these examples. So we can't say that patriarchy is totally abnormal. It has become very normalized, but it goes against our better interest as a species. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. Now, I've been looking at this question for a bit and I've been contemplating what it means. It's so clear. There's so much ample evidence of these women honoring societies. There's lots of figurines of females. We say female deities. They look pretty human. From Mexico, in Turkey, all over the world, we found these primarily female carvings from ancient history. Now, a lot of the problem with understanding our pre-patriarchal past is that when the patriarchs took over, they tended to try to annihilate the cultures before them. And that's still happening to this day. We see, the Taliban blowing up statues of the Buddha. You see a lot of the, when the Christian missionaries came to the Americas and they outlawed all of these indigenous cultures. And one of the biggest clashes between patriarchy and matriarchy happened in Eastern North America at the time of the European colonization back in the 15 and 1600s. And it's very clear, there's lots of evidence also that the Eastern tribes, like the Iroquois, did follow a very matrilineal society. Women had a lot of power. Now, they still had a very gender segregated society, and their culture was very different, both from what it is now and, from what you might expect is like, and I think that the biggest problem that people have when they start talking about matriarchy and patriarchy is they're trying to position them as sort of men are in charge versus women are in charge. But that isn't really how it goes. When women are in charge, they tend to share power and they tend to give equally between men and women. And I think there's an interesting genetic parallel to this societal influence. A mother gives, first of all, she gives more of her DNA to her children and she gives her own blood through the pregnancy process. So even compared to other animals, the human female gives more biologically to her children. So she gives an X chromosome, and an X chromosome is much bigger than the Y chromosome, and it does a lot. The Y chromosome, on the other hand, is very small. It really doesn't do much. It basically makes the animal into a male, and it doesn't do a whole lot else. So for a son of, his mother has given him an X chromosome that's active in all of his cells, right? Except for in the testicles, which is where the Y chromosome does its work. And on the other hand, a male gives unequally to his daughter. He actually gives more genetic information to his daughter than his son. But what he gives his son is this maleness. So the patrilineal obsession, which we see a lot in religions, especially in the Abrahamic religions. Abraham himself was considered to be a patriarch, but he was a pretty nasty guy. I mean, he was very violent. He was very irrational. He was trashing the previous religion that the women were practicing. There was a lot of incest and inbreeding. It was not they weren't very pleasant people. I think most Jews or Christians today would not recognize this Abraham fellow as one of them. He would probably be outcast. He would probably even be in jail. He tried to kill his own son. So this obsession with the father-son role, it was very toxic. The fact that this voice was telling him to kill his own son, and then the voice told him not to, so he didn't. It's not a very moral story. It's not very inspiring. So there is a negativity to patriarchy, and that's why, another reason why I'm against it. So this going against our better interest of putting the obviously more important parent first, in the sense of how we track our genealogy, for example, and in the sense of how we organize our society. Now, most people today in, a sort of free society where there's not the same obligation to get married and we don't follow the same customs, we tend to just do what comes easiest. We still follow a lot of patriarchal ideas. And I find it very concerning because it means that we're not understanding the mistakes that we've made in the past. And it's forgivable because we're so short-lived, really. And when we try to understand our history, we're going back hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years even. If we want to look at human history alone, we're looking at over 200,000 years ago when human beings started to leave Africa. And if you go even further back, I mean, the migration out of Africa actually goes to our pre-human ancestors. We only have one great ape species, besides humans, that left Africa, which is the orangutan, which is in Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not going to get sidetracked into going to our ancient migration, but it's clear that patriarchy was not the norm in our ancient history. And what I'm putting together now is that actually during the time that our brains were getting bigger and our intelligence was increasing and our use of tools and culture, at the time that that was getting more advanced, we were following the matriarchal culture. Now, what's happened between the last 10,000 years, and that has increased in the last 4,000 years, is that our brains are actually getting smaller. And what I think, what I hypothesize, is that that is because of patriarchy. Because patriarchy takes away the positive attributes of understanding that mothers are so important and essential at a biological level. Now, you may argue, well, not all mothers are very nice or very good. They're not all good at being mothers, and that's very true. But how could they be if they've been so devalued for so long? I think a lot of the evidence too showing how we began using advanced medicine is that it was the women who were understanding how to go through the birthing process better. Because birth is very dangerous for women. It's very dangerous for infants. We actually keep track of maternal mortality and infant mortality because we know that during the time of birth, there is a high likelihood that the mother or the child could die, or both even, because we are simply not that well designed for birth. And what I'm saying is that patriarchy has actually made the birthing process worse for women. And a lot of the mentality of patriarchy is suffering. There's this obsession with suffering, and as though women deserve it. They deserve to suffer, and they deserve to be weaker, and they deserve to have all these negativity. But if you look at that ancient ancestry, what the humans were doing back then was to help this process. They recognized that women did have it hard, and they put all this effort in to make it easier. Now, the patriarchy comes in and doesn't care one bit because the patriarchy is interested in power. And if you look at the biological differences between males and females, if you put the male first in this reproductive role, you're basically devaluing the birth process completely. Now, a lot of how we talk about patriarchy, I did say the patriarchy. I try to avoid saying the patriarchy because I don't really see it that way. I see patriarchy as multiple because there's so many different cultures now that practice patriarchy. The most concerning that I find is atheist patriarchy, because there's no longer this fantasy god that they're applying this to. Instead, it's a very, very twisted notion of male dominance. Now, I want to also divide those two concepts, so patriarchy versus male dominance. We know that in a lot of our mammal cousins, most of them, not all, a lot of them, the males are bigger than the females. Often the males are stronger than the females. Often the males are more violent, and that is true for a lot of different animals. We've got the hoofed animals, and almost all of the males of those species have big horns, and they engage in violent attacks on each other. We can see even with elephants, a lot of the large male elephants can be very dangerous, and a lot of elephant society is organized around the females protecting each other and protecting their offspring from the males. It's a very stressful society, isn't it? It's very stressful to be a mammal. And I think because the mammal biology requires women to put more energy into creating and nurturing these offspring, what that has done is it's made this sort of extra energy for males that they have used to become more aggressive, which is kind of unfortunate, I think. Now, the other group of animals that I find really interesting and that I think we kind of aspire to are the birds, and the birds are actually the reverse of us when it comes to genetics. So, whereas in human beings, the male is heterozygous, meaning he's got two different chromosomes, two different sex chromosomes, the X and the Y, whereas the females are homozygous, we've got two X chromosomes. In birds, it's the opposite. So, because we've chosen to define female as the one that creates the egg, and the males as the one that creates sperm, we've reversed that genetic influence in the bird world. So really, if you were to look at it only genetically, then the male bird is homozygous and the female bird is heterozygous. So that's an interesting little tidbit that we don't, a lot of people don't want to look at, but I think that we just really need to take a step back and try to be a little bit more objective. I think a lot of times people are trying to put people into boxes and say you have to behave this way because you're a male or a female. But that doesn't really make sense, because if we wanted to follow nature, we would just allow people to behave in the way that seems most natural to them. And that's all you would have to do. Now, a lot of women simply don't have that maternal instinct. And that's just part of how it is. In all of the mammal species that I'm talking about, too, there are bad mothers. There are bad mothers. There's mothers that will kill their own infants. There's mothers that will abandon them or attack them. And you see that. That's why there's so many rescued animals, because the mother did not have that instinct, or it was shut down in her, or maybe she was traumatized in her own infancy and carried that through to the next generation. So when I'm saying that the mother is more important, I'm not saying that every mother is a perfect mother. I'm saying that biologically that's a fact. It's just a fact. And I feel like we're really losing that sense of how to take care of ourselves as a species. Now, I haven't really talked about feminism that much. Obviously, feminism and patriarchy kind of go hand in hand. A lot of people will look at feminism as a way of undoing patriarchy. But I think that there are certain, strands of feminism that are promoting patriarchy, unfortunately. And I think it's because it's such an intellectual discussion. And I think a big part of the problem is that we're so focused on language instead of biology. I'm starting to see myself as kind of a biological feminist. That's kind of the best way that I would put it, because I don't feel that women can actually be empowered without being healthy. And I think what's happened is that nowadays women's health has been put on the back burner as though it's kind of a choice. And women's empowerment is seen as more of just the choice part of it, the pro-choice part. But choice without knowledge is really ignorance, right? Like, you can make a choice, but if you don't know what choice you're making or why you're making it, how could you make the right choice? So for me, the way I see it is that pregnancy is always disempowering for women when they're pregnant, even though in the long run it may be empowering for them. But I think we've just made a language decision where empowerment has become about feeling empowered as opposed to being empowered. And being empowered, is it real? You may have power over others or you don't. I don't feel empowered. I feel empowered to make my own decisions. I don't feel powerful over anyone. If you're listening to me and I'm influencing you, then that's great. That is power, right? And you may have power too if you have a conversation with someone and you get them thinking about something different, an influencer, or we influence each other So there is power to that. Like that's actual power. If you're in a position of office and your decisions are carried out by other people, that's also power. If you're strong and healthy and you're able to, you know, chop down trees and cut your own wood for fire and live off the land in that kind of way, like that's also very powerful. So I question the definition of empowerment as a feeling rather than as something actual that you're having power over and defining that in a more real way. Again, it comes back to like that we are physical beings, we are organisms, we are animals. And as human beings, I feel that we have an obligation to use our intelligence, to use our intellect in order to make our physical reality better. But how do we make it better? For a lot of people, I think they just think that it's better when you have more choices or when you're more comfortable. And that might be part of it. But I think that coming back to really focusing on being as healthy as possible is also really important. And that means having the best possible healthcare in reproductive medicine specifically. So, going over a little bit about why I believe this reduction in our intelligence is coming from patriarchy and from patriarchal ways is because of the physical reality of what patriarchy did differently than matriarchy. So, imagine matriarchy. This is a equal, egalitarian society. So, men still have power, but they just don't have power over women. They have power over their own lives. A lot of times, there still is gender segregation, but it's often a lot looser. There's more options for people. In a lot of indigenous societies, transsexual or transgender people were recognized. They weren't forced to behave like a man or a woman. There was a lot more leniency and a lot less coercion. There was less coercion into behaving a certain way as a conformist. Instead, there is more of an obligation to help others in your community. So it's a very different kind of obligation. In patriarchy, you have the obligation to provide for the powers above you. In the matriarchy, you have the obligation to provide for the people that are less powerful than you. So it's a very different kind of obligation. And we see this sort of dichotomy in a lot of politics too. The politics of trying to help people versus the politics of trying to get ahead. Now, the other part of patriarchy that I believe has led to our reduction in health and intelligence is promoting a very young age of marriage, especially for girls. Teenage girls, although many of them are reproductive, are still not good at it. It's still much more dangerous. Just because you can have a baby when you're a teenager doesn't mean that it's going to be the same as someone in their 20s. A woman in her 20s is far more likely to have a healthy pregnancy than a teenager, and far less likely to die and far less likely to have birth complications and complications for the child. So if we look at that, it's that alone. If you're looking at a very small individual, she's been a teenager, so she's not fully grown. We continue to grow all the way until our early 20s. We're not fully developed. It's even more obvious with teenage boys. A 13-year-old boy looks like a boy. He doesn't look like a man. And yet in the patriarchy, they tell him he's a man. It's just mind-blowing. So just because you can become reproductive at a young age doesn't mean that it's going to be as healthy than if you wait. I see that as sort of like our emergency clause as a species, like when times get tough and people are dying at 30, that you want to get going on that faster. But that's not an ideal way to live. That's not a positive human way to live. So as you're selecting for these younger girls to have children, automatically their babies are going to be smaller, right? So right there you have this selection for younger acting, smaller children. So less life experience, less wisdom, less knowledge, less intelligence, less maturity. So already that's holding us back a lot by allowing or even encouraging teenage pregnancies. That's one of the biggest ways that I believe that patriarchy is negatively influencing our evolution. Now you could argue, well, even in matriarchies, also girls and boys were getting married very young. That's true, but often that was optional as opposed to obligated. Right now, and in our patriarchal ancestry in Europe and Asia, there is a very strong push for young women to marry their own relatives. So here we go, inbreeding. This comes up again in how we're going wrong as a species. Inbreeding is another factor that has been very obvious in patriarchy. And I believe that's has to do with the connection between patriarchy and power. If you look at the people who have practiced inbreeding, which is to say they marry their own cousins, their own relatives, even Abraham married his own niece. So that's a very close relative. We know that when brothers and sisters have children, they turn out very, very genetically disabled. Royal lineages have gone extinct because of inbreeding. And it's been a really slow road to understand just how negative that is. And it's like power eats itself. And it's like a self destructive thing to have this sort of power. And I think that patriarchy is inherently self destructive. It is destroying us at a very profound evolutionary genetic level. So, inbreeding, which we know causes all kinds of genetic disorders, and it's not just about recessive genes, it's bigger than that. There are multigenic problems that come from consanguineous relationships. That's been shown in the literature, a lot of different literature and a lot of different populations. Today, we have so many different groups that still practice inbreeding. Almost all of the Middle Eastern cultures, a lot of South Asian cultures, even to the level of inbreeding within the caste system in India. And the forced marriage of young girls goes to the point where if she refuses to marry her own relative as a teenager, that she risks her own life and she will be killed. And today, honor killing is very common, and it's spread all over the world now with immigration. And basically, it's like forcing this really, really, like the most damaging kind of reproduction you could imagine. So today, in these patriarchal cultures, we see this. We see young people getting murdered because they don't want to follow in this genetically self-destructive programming of patriarchy. It's not just out there in other cultures; it's everywhere now, and I think it's increasing. And since the 1960s, we see that the overall population, the gender ratio of the global population has been skewed toward males. So we have more and more males in our culture since the 1960s. And it's only been going back the other way over the last 5 years. Now, a lot of people don't want to talk about femicide. They don't want to talk about the fact that a lot of that is honor killings of young women, teenagers and young women who have refused to marry within the inbreeding lines and wanted to be, you know, basically good, normal animals, which is to desire this vigor and life and passion and love for other people. And what you see in these matriarchal traditions is the exact opposite, where there are a lot of cultures, especially indigenous cultures, that require you to marry outside of your clan. So it's the exact opposite. It's called exogamy. So that's when you're encouraged to marry someone who's very different than you. There are some cultures in the Amazon where you were required to marry someone who speaks a different language than you. So this is the healthy way to do things, and this is something that also comes naturally. So the power that I was mentioning, the patriarchal power, and the cases in the Americas where they did see inbreeding was in the colonial cultures. So the Inca and the Aztecs, they were the ones that were practicing inbreeding. So again, royal lineages. So it's not a racial thing how this happens. It's definitely a cultural thing that happens in certain circumstances. When people want power and they want to keep it within their family group, they will hold everyone into that and build big walls around it and force people to marry their own relatives. And it's just, I mean, it turns my stomach, but that mentality obviously has some role in nature. It is a part of us. There's a biological push behind that, and it does happen in nature. I mean, well, I need to say with nature, when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time on my relatives' farms, and you could see that there were cats that were clearly inbred, and it's because they didn't have a larger pool of cats. A cat on the farm has to travel quite a bit to find other cats in other places. So you could see that these kittens were getting smaller, they were getting less healthy. So I could see for myself the effects of inbreeding and how damaging that is. I also come from, I have a Quebecois lineage, and I've looked at the documents, and it is very, very inbred as well. And there's lots of genetic diseases in Quebec that could be attributed to that. Jewish culture has a long history of inbreeding, and although there are certain positive attributes that have come out of, Jewish ethnicity, the fact is that usually when that happens in nature, it's after there's been a lot of people who died, and unfortunately, the ancestral stories of Judaism are all about genocide and getting wiped out and fighting with other groups of people. And fighting with other groups of people is all about what patriarchy is, because they don't put those things in place to get along with each other. They are always fighting each other. And the irony about these patriarchal cultures that fight each other is that they will often see the differences between them as the reason why they're fighting. But what I see is it's the similarities that they have between each other, which is why they're fighting. So the patriarchy of Islam and the patriarchy of Judaism are fighting right now. So it's not that it's because they're so different. I would say it's because of the similarities between them and that origin, that Abrahamic origin, that believes in the apocalypse. They teach the apocalypse because the apocalypse is the only inevitable outcome of patriarchy, because the man is the more violent of the two genders in our culture. So if we put that first, we're going to keep devaluing our health and well-being, and we're going to keep promoting violence, antagonism, separation, segregation, apartheid. All of these things are the outcome of patriarchy. The matriarchal societies are far more open, but unfortunately, that openness, that exogamy, that pacifism within matriarchy is exactly what gets attacked by patriarchal cultures and exactly what puts them in a weaker position. And you see this pattern over and over, that the matriarchal cultures are so kind and so open and so helpful, but that has been used against them to harm them and to be taken over again. So we need to have some wisdom with that, and we need to have, I think, more self-defense as people, not just women, but as people who want to have a more matriarchal and matrilineal and egalitarian society. Because the fact is that matriarchy is our best bet for egalitarianism. And it's not just women in power, because patriarchal women in power are very different, and they often behave exactly as a man would, because they're following the patriarchal order. And there's lots of patriarchal women, and I think it's even gotten more extreme, because today you can say that you're a feminist while you're fully practicing and endorsing patriarchy, which is mind-blowing to me. But it's because I think we have so few examples of what a real matriarchy looks like. There's a tribe of people in China, we have Navajo, Iroquois, different tribes within the Native American communities, but also there's not a lot of information or education in the wider educational world about that and what that looks like. Now, a lot of those cultures, because they're very tribal, they follow all kinds of other cultural practices that are very individual to them. And I'm not saying that we should all try to be exactly like the Navajo, but what we need to understand is that it is possible. And because we are so globalized, and because we are more free now, we should use that freedom to switch our society into a more matrilineal society. And the easiest way to do that, for one thing, is to completely stop women from changing their last names after they get married, which is a very, very patriarchal tradition. And I have no idea why women keep doing this, especially women that seem to be independent and educated, and they don't seem to understand just how dark and self-destructive that act is. And it's just because of custom. They just want to imitate what their, grandparents did without understanding that their grandparents were carrying on a tradition with a very, very dark history. The other thing is just passing the last names on to children. Now, the whole idea of last names is fairly recent. And I think maybe that's a discussion that we need to be having more. Why do we have last names? I think part of why we have last names is because of our increased population, because there's so many people now that keeping track of who's who and who comes from who has gotten so complicated. If we look at, my tradition, so my last name's Anderson, that means at some point in my ancestry, there was a guy named Andrew who had a son. And at some point they decided, okay, we're not gonna name you after your father anymore. Now you're going to be named after the father's father, and it's going to be this passing on of the same name and not a new name. In Iceland, they still practice the old way. So if you're Johann's daughter, that means you're Johann's daughter. That's your last name because your father's name was Johann. So, the question of last names is much more complicated than just patriarchy, matriarchy. But I think it's something that we should really look at in more detail because as our population explodes, as we have such an international, globalized world where people are moving all the time from country to country within years, there's families now that live in like 3 different continents and they're moving all the time. So I think that having a more well-established understanding of what our last names mean could lead us to, I think, a matrilineal tradition that would make a lot more sense. Again, it's for the simple reason that not only is your mother more certainly your mother. Now, of course, people do get switched at birth when they go into hospitals and, um, there's all kinds of stuff with artificial reproduction that confuses that matter. But we know that your mother is more important biologically, so why would we not use the mother's lineage as a way to track ourselves and not the father's one? The whole naming through the father system, I think it was almost like as a status, where as a woman, you're not considered as good if you don't have a husband. And that goes back to that whole, shaming the illegitimate children and that's patriarchy, right? That's what it comes down to, is that patriarchy is so much about the ownership of the female reproductive system so that women no longer have control over their own bodies. And not only is that disempowering, but that is a threat to the woman herself. And I think we've seen that play out in, just how many women used to die in childbirth and how many women are still dying in those places where patriarchy is so enforced. And that, unfortunately, it's all over the world. The fact is those patriarchal reproductive cultural norms are destructive to our health. And I believe that they are leading us to annihilation of our species. Through violence, but also through poor health, through a reduction in intelligence, and a reduction in our ability to get along with each other. I think the rise of autism is really about the destruction of our social intelligence, that we have become so self-absorbed, so wrapped up in this patriarchal, status-chasing, mechanical, very greedy, and anti-cultural, disrespectful to the arts, disrespectful to any kind of softness or femininity. We sort of look down on that and shun it. And I think that is dangerous. A lot has been said about Native American stereotypes. The noble savage is one of them. But as I was reading about these Eastern tribes and from the perspective of the early colonizers and settlers from Europe, It's just how kind they were and how gentle they were. So, how much they focused their energy on getting along with each other, family bonding, making sure everyone had someone to take care of them. The whole origin of Thanksgiving comes from understanding these cultures that were so giving, and yet we didn't learn the lesson and we haven't become as kind and giving as they have. So we have a long way to go if we want to continue to survive on this planet. And we really need to pull back on just following this patriarchal order. Your culture may have become patriarchal, but that's not who you are. You know, you don't need that. We don't need it. We can, if we really try, make a better society. But I really feel that we need to understand how wrong patriarchy has been for us, how dangerous it is, and that it is actually getting more and more dangerous. If you're an atheist and you still practice patriarchy, you really need to give your head a shake and ask yourself why you're doing this. You know, we had Jesus as an example who was, relative to the people around him, pretty much a feminist. And Christianity was the dominator patriarchal culture that disempowered those other cultures. So that's a bad sign if the most feminist we have is Judaism and Christianity, because traditionally they're really not very matriarchal at all. If anything, the very existence of Judaism is about attacking the previous matriarchal culture. So I hope that I've at least made you question, if you are a patriarchist, if you do believe in patriarchy, that you maybe take a step back and question why. Because it really has to do with our biology. We are mammals, and I think that if we want to be an intelligent species, we need to go with that natural way that we have already established instead of fighting against it and pushing people into just doing things for the sake of their own desire rather than the well-being of their own self. And if you take care of your own self, then you're automatically taking care of the people around you. That's about all I have to say right now for patriarchy. So thanks for joining me. And I'm going to be starting a discussion. This podcast has been fun all on my own, but I would like to do some more interviews. So I'm going to be starting that, and I'm going to be doing that with Omar Romero. So check that out. I'm going to be doing that on YouTube. I'm going to continue doing the Neverending Experiment here on Spotify. This is Kim Anderson. It's been the Neverending Experiment, and have a great couple weeks. Thanks.